Okay. We do have more than a quarter of an hour for questions. So just please be concise so we'll have time for the answers as well. Okay, so go ahead. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for those three very interesting interventions. I had three questions. The first is for Ori and Itay. I was wondering what kind of school is Walter Benjamin talking about? Because, I'm a sociologist. I'm very, I like things that are here. And I found myself thinking in ancient Greece, did women go to school? Did slaves go to school? Did the sons of farmers who lived away from the city go to school? So is a school really about a free school for individuals who can rest? Or, and even when he writes, what kind of school is it? For whom is it? And is the violence only in taking the people away from their social position and dispensing them knowledge? Or is it, as Pierre Bourdieu said, in the choosing of the knowledge? Because the elite do have some knowledge. They have knowledge on the noble subjects. But people who are not from the elite also have knowledge. And the way that school is made, a teacher teaching things to students, sometimes violently, corporal punishments being an example, can also show that the violence in educating can also be this. And I had two questions for Ruth. During your presentation, still as, same boring sociologist, I found myself wondering, is a dialogue always between equals? And the answer in sociology is, of course, no. It can be, but it's often not. And I think I understand where you come from, but part of me was very frustrated because I felt like you were taking, and maybe that is the basis of discourse analysis, these arguments, comparing them as if they are equal, when in a sociology point of view, social point of view, they are not. And I was wondering, this is a vast question, how can we put power structures, context, historical, political, social context, how can we put all that into discourse analysis? Should we put all that into a discourse analysis? My answer is yes, but I'm not a discourse analyst. And my other question was, so you mentioned Churchill and the Nazis. When exactly, in that option that we can stop talking, when do we stop talking? Because I do believe Churchill talked to the Nazis. He talked to the English Nazis. He couldn't avoid it. They were in the English politics. He didn't talk to Hitler when his crimes and his intentions came to light. So when exactly, where do we draw the line, in discourse analysis? And that's it. Thank you.
I'm so sorry I missed the first talk, so I don't have a question for you, but I can connect it maybe with Ruth's talk. In Benjamin's critique of violence, he talks about also the violence of doing nothing, and precisely with regard to the strike. The strike is another example where we have an example of doing nothing, but it's still under some conditions considered to be violent. And I was wondering how this can help us also to understand the violence of boycotts. And Benjamin has this distinction between a political strike, which is extortion, it's a form of blackmail, if you use doing nothing simply in order to exert pressure, as you said. But there's also what he calls the proletarian general strike, which is not to use doing nothing as a means to pressure somebody, but simply to sever relation. You go away, you do something completely different. And I was wondering if you can also apply this idea to the question of BDS. So it is violence if it is to blackmail or to exert pressure, but there's also an anarchist version of it, which aims at completely changing the system, jumping outside of the system of the nation state altogether. And according to Benjamin, that would then no longer be considered violence, but something else. And that would mean that the problem with BDS might not be that it is too radical, but that it is not radical enough, that it does not question political institutions radically enough. So I was wondering what you would say to that. And I also have a question to Girinandini. I absolutely loved your talk. I thought it was really inspiring. I was wondering if you can say maybe more a little bit about the gendered aspect of listening, sound, and affect. So, especially because listening is often considered to be a more female activity rather than, speaking or also writing, or maybe in general, we can say that our culture is a very sight-oriented, light-oriented culture. And there is something, I don't know, I mean, we can say maybe like the passivity of listening or so has an affinity to, or there at least there's a gendered element of it. Maybe you can just elaborate if that plays any role in your account.
Don't you think that the considering the Zionism as the ultimate representation of the Jews is an act of violence? Because by definition, any act of representation will never be able to include everyone in the aimed group. Another problem with the terminology that you used, the self-determination. This self-determination was not mentioned in the establishment Declare of Israel. Megillat Ha'atzmaut. It was not mentioned in this document. The last questions, the question, do you make the oppressed and the oppressor equal in this, let's say, equation? Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much.
I have an open-ended question to Ms. Ruth Amossy. I am an outsider. I am a lawyer and a veteran of the Israeli diplomatic service. So, listening to you, the connection between classical sense, maybe boycott, and focus on BDS, inevitably it comes to our mind, my mind certainly as a lawyer and a veteran of public service, the application of it to the situation in real time now in Israel. It's very clear, even very open. So the boycott now in Israel, the protest, is turning now as we speak in this time, and it's already under active consideration to different forms of civil disobedience. Even what might be under consideration, and here we're getting still maybe to theory, not paying taxes or some restrictions or army service, obligatory or not obligatory. Again, in form of civil disobedience. So my question as a lawyer, I am contemplating if disobeying laws is a violence. And I know it's a very open question, and the bottom line, that certainly if the boycott will be raised on a high level, including not paying taxes, so it's now already, it could be said that a boycott will be claimed as a form of violence by the ruler. I'm not talking about the Israeli government now, but by the ruler. So, so the question is, if, bottom line, if boycotting dictatorship measures can be considered as violence. Boycotting dictatorship measures, if can be considered as violence. I know all this is open questions, but you are academician focusing on this, so I will be very curious to hear your opinion. Thank you.
And the last one, very, very quickly. Okay. Wow. Okay. Yalla.
Okay. I had a lot of questions, but I have to make it one because there's no time for Ruth. Yes. So my remark is about the choice of what discourse are we analyzing? Why do we choose this discourse and not other discourses? Especially considering reality. Like if you consider it 20 kilometers to the east, you have like the city of Qalqilia in the West Bank, where the IDF imposes curfew whenever it wants, killing, controlling, thirsting, starving, building walls, illegal administrative detentions of even small children, while building and expanding illegal settlements. While we're discussing if boycott, if BDS is a form of violence, I think the discussion should be like the terminology should be, is boycott in this case a term of resistance, not violence. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I was wondering what is the role of tradition yet, because you mentioned it, but you didn't develop it, especially when you talked about deconstructing the I and getting out of the subject position. So which borders do we still have? Is it important? And also to refer to the question of what schools are we talking about, I'd like to ask, is there any importance to the question what knowledge is delivered? Or is it just a matter of practice, of like losing oneself in a sea in which you can teach whatever you teach, you know? So, and just to Girinandini, if you can say maybe a sentence about listening to yourself talking. I think it's part of the bodily experience of not only listening to others, but also the fact that when we speak, we also hear ourselves. And how do you understand that as a spoken word artist and also as a researcher? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Girinandini, could you start by answering, and then we'll focus on this statement.
Absolutely. I'll start with the first question that I got, which is about thinking of listening as in terms of gender, which is so interesting because yes, listening as a general act is often thought to be like of the female domain, of the domestic domain. But a lot of the research that I turned to really understand listening as a method in epistemology comes from medical sciences, and it comes from a lot of male researchers. It's honestly, I think it comes down to the context in which we're looking at it, because when you look at listening in terms of patient care and in terms of how doctors deal with patient care beyond the traditional interviews, so this is your bedside manner, etc., the idea of listening and truly listening to what is said and what is not said is very, very important, and it is sort of how they develop their care techniques. And if you recontextualize that in that scenario, it loses that truly, gendered binary structure. But at the same time, I think that when you bring it into the educational context, oftentimes it is something that you would, I suppose, think of as something that is of the feminine domain. I don't know what the correct answer really here is. I find it very interesting to see so much of this literally comes down to reframing and how you look at the act of listening and what it stands for. So what you hear and what you don't hear, what you choose to listen to, it's a very violent act. Listening is a very violent act, if I'm being completely honest, because you tune things out and you tune things in, and it is entirely our own agency that allows us to do that. So yeah, I think if I have a clear answer, I'm not sure. I feel like I'm talking in circles right now. But I think it is something that is worth looking into for sure. And the second question was about
listening to yourself.
About stories of self. I think that is a very, very important thing because using poetry and sound and storytelling in educational research as a way of decolonial work, to me, is a lot about speaking yourself into being. So speaking your identity into existence and speaking facets of our identity that we don't get to actually put into or bring into our learning environments. For me, as a PhD student, when I was applying for my position at Cambridge, I had to really put myself in this very specific way. So there were massive parts of myself that I had to ignore as a way of making myself the best candidate who gets the best funding options, gets the best application options. And those are parts of myself that I had to cut out so I could fit into the traditional institution. Those were the bits of me that I was silencing. But they are still part of my learning identity. They're still part of what I bring into the classroom. They're still part of how I approach learning new material and doing research, also my identity as a researcher. So the idea of using poetry and sound and storytelling as a way of really walking into my research and developing my research, for me, is a very powerful act of healing the self and also sounding the self. And in a lot of the workshops that I conduct as part of my field work, these are things that keep coming up, especially with the participants. There are so many facets of themselves that they do feel like they get to finally meet again, finally reintroduce themselves to. So it ends up being a really healing journey, but at the same time, it gives us a lot of data as to how we are approaching education, how we are approaching the methods of teaching, how we are approaching this idea of pedagogy. So many times it's just, I'm the teacher standing in front of the classroom and I'm just going to talk and talk and talk at you. But there's not that vibrant relationship of a back and forth. And I think a lot of that kind of ends up being interrogated through these stories of self and through this act of listening. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Many thanks. So,
Okay, thanks for the question. So first clarification, probably we rushed too quickly because we realized that that is too long. Benjamin does not speak or does not write about the school. Well, he does mention school in several places in his writings, but mostly negatively. But we did not say anything about that. Benjamin mentions in his text on violence, he mentions educative violence enigmatically without explaining. This is the challenge for us. We looked at some other places which Benjamin refers to education or pedagogy. One of them refers to scholastic practices, Christian scholastic practices from the Middle Ages. Anyway, so we hinged on this reference to scholasticism to try to apply Benjamin's notion of educative violence to contemporary theories of schooling, because on the one hand, there are some very important, I think, rethinkings of schooling today. To be very brief, it is very, very popular, even in the coffee talk before this panel, to attack school, to revive Ivan Illich's famous deschooling society. Very fashionable, school is terrible. Deschooling means privatization. Deschooling, I insist, deschooling means neoliberalism, further neoliberalization of society. School needs to be defended. So the model I use for defending school, taken from Jan Maskelyne, is beautiful. I try to say some things about it, but it does not take violence into consideration. I try to show, yes, there is some violent aspect inherently in school, but this educative violence can be something democratic, anti-elitist. Now, the Greek school is an inspiration. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, women or girls were not allowed. Slaves were not allowed, exactly. But I don't think this is a serious problem. The idea was that once you enter, you become equal to everybody else. They did not allow women. We, of course, will allow women. Real school that is not the school. Most schools we know today are the schools, obviously. But real school is one in which you enter and you stop being rich or poor, black or white, boy or girl, and you become a student. You are relieved from this baggage of home, of family, of pupil means orphan. So it sounds awful. But it sounds awful, but you temporarily become an orphan. It can be liberating. I'm not supposed to be what my father was, what my mother expects me to be. This is the liberation school allows. It takes violence to liberate. This was what I'm trying to say.
Very, very quickly.
Yeah. And it's a violence that does not create this legal order. That was the point. Tradition, very quickly. So, and the content. Okay, two things. Benjamin deals with tradition in the context of modernity, where he deals with the other of modernity. Okay, and offers us an experiment. Okay, I mean later in his writings, what would happen if we would treat modernity as tradition? What would that change? For instance, to what extent it would give us a tactile knowledge of our past and not something that is very distant, that we see from the distance. So this practice is related to a certain content, to a historical content, and we should think of that. Okay, just and the issue of whether it's further practice, just practice. The idea is that the desubjectifying practice is something like the Foucauldian ascesis. Okay, so it's very active. It's not merely losing one's boundaries, but rather allows a certain kind of recognition. It allows a certain kind of desubjectification that is productive and can be productive in acts of resistance. And I'll finish here.
Thanks very much, Ruth. You have so many questions in so few minutes.
No, you'll give me some more minutes, I'm sure.
You're hungry, all of you. I'm going to eat.
Everybody took his time. I will take mine. This is an act of civil disobedience. Okay, anyway, very quickly. You asked about dialogue between equals. That's not exactly the topic. I was trying to take the notion of boycott, first of all, at two levels, okay? There is the very general level. Is boycott a violent action, something violent? So, this was the first idea when I started. Now, I needed an example, a case study, because you cannot work without case studies. So I took this one. It is not a dialogue anyway, because there is no dialogue. You know, there are people saying that and the others saying this is not even a polemics. Okay, those are parallel discourses that are polarized. This is one thing. Now, about the other question, where is the line where you can say, okay, with this guy or with this group, we do not speak. It will be ethically wrong to speak. So even if I'm not a sociologist, I believe in context, and I really think it's very important to study each example in its context. So Perlman gave the example of Churchill. It was after World War II, and he didn't elaborate on it, okay? But it's clear that to decide that somebody will not be talked to, that you are going to boycott him, not let him speak and not listen to him, you have to prove that the guy is not commendable. And this was done here. I don't say it's good or not good, because I'm sorry, but as a discourse analyst and an argumentation specialist, I do not, if you want to have my mind, I will tell you on lunch. I'm just looking here at the text, okay? So you have to prove that this was done through an act of demonization. I mean, the example given, I tried to give you some examples, are very extreme as proving that really you cannot talk with such a group, okay? If they are exact or not is another story, because you would have to examine it, okay? Which I did not do, of course. Is it true that the Israeli politics all the time incite hatred against the Palestinian citizen in Israel? I'm not so sure, but that's not the point here. So that's one thing. Now, so you do not have absolute rule, but you really have to prove that according to your values, and it depends on your values, according to your values, this party is absolutely not commendable, and you are not going to speak with it. This what was done with the Front National at the time. if it was a good tactic, I don't want to speak about that. Turned out that not so very good, but that's not the question either. Okay, so the second thing was about exert pressure or sever relation. I think that in this case, it is exerting pressure as an instrumental means. This would be my definition. Again, if it's a good means or not very good means can be discussed, okay? But it's not a question of my opinion. And it could be, of course, much more radical. So if you take, for instance, the nonviolent action of Gandhi, this would be a very, very extreme action that would be much more radical. Can you imagine all the Palestinians acting like in India and said, okay, we are not fighting you, but we are not doing anything. You know, we are on the floor. We are here. You want to kill us. You want to, Israeli would never, how could they deal with that? Okay. So this would be a very, very radical action. I don't think BDS is more than instrumental. And, okay, it's a way, why not, that they try to adopt. So, about, self-determination, the oppressor and the oppressed, I don't want to use this term here because I think we should really, if you want to talk about it, we should see the context of everything, you know, and go deeper into it and not come with this, okay, we have categories, so everything is simple and clear. No, everything here is not simple and clear, and saying oppressor and oppressed doesn't solve the problem, as we can see. So I will not answer to that. Of course, they are not equal. That's not the question, but it doesn't solve the problem. Now, about your very disturbing question, I would say that that boycott is not civil disobedience. You know, I was working before on France, you know, when the anti-vax movement, this anti-vaccine movement. And so they spoke about health dictatorship, la dictature sanitaire. And as there was health dictatorship, they had to resist, of course, and they would do an act of civil disobedience, like not taking the vaccine or going out when it is forbidden and opening the restaurants when the law said that they should stay closed. Okay, so this was, and they were talking at the time of civil disobedience, but boycott is not exactly an act of civil disobedience. And in what is done now in Israel, you can see what we are doing now. I don't feel that we are boycotting. We are protesting. We are demonstrating. We are trying to stop things. But for the time, we are not really boycotting.
We're much beyond the time. So it's just
Okay. So maybe we can talk about it later on. And I don't know about the choice of discourse. I don't know. I didn't understand the question because, of course, the BDS is an act of resistance. It defined itself as an act of resistance. So I tried to choose the discourse of the BDS. But the discourse of the BDS is a discourse that is not written in Palestine. It is a discourse that is written abroad. It is written by Palestinians and by other people abroad. I didn't go to the Palestinian living. I don't know where you were talking about, not to ask them what they would say.
Let's go over.
Okay? So maybe we should listen to them too.
actually it was originated in Ramallah, but okay. Thank you so much. And now lunch.